Please welcome to Talk of the Town, Tom Eamon. Good morning, sir.
I'm really delighted to be with you, Henry. You have a great interview style, and it's a real privilege to be on your program.
Well, it's a privilege to have you
And
here.
Might mention the people at Jefferson's. They're delightful people. They're not a bookstore as such. They sell
Right.
everything but books, just about. But they're going to be having the book tonight, and of course, the book has been available in other stores in the Greenville area. But we'll be at Jefferson's, and it is a wine tasting. But I go in there to buy chocolate quite a lot, and so they have told me they're going to have chocolate also.
They have a
It's
lot of
5
good
to 7
chocolate
this evening.
They have a lot of great delicacies down there, so that's a great spot. And I know you'll have a good crowd tonight. Let's talk about the book. The book is about North Carolina politics and the history that goes back to Carr Scott. And Carr Scott was a governor what years?
He was elected in 1948, and back then governors were limited to one term, and so he was inaugurated in January of 1949 and served for 4 years.
So you cover the era from then till the late 40s to the current day where Pat McCrory was elected.
Absolutely. Have a little bit in the prologue about the earlier period going way back
Right.
to 1900, but it's mainly from 1948 to now.
You know, it's interesting. This year, the country will be focused on North Carolina because of the Senate race. They say this is going to be the most expensive Senate race, U.S. Senate race in the country this year.
Then, of course, we have Clay Aiken running.
Yeah, exactly. You got Clay Aiken running for Congress as
Yes.
well. So there have been some interesting characters over the
Indeed.
year. But North Carolina has a very storied political history. I mean, when you think back through history, you think about names like Terry Sanford and Jesse Helms. We've had John Edwards here. I mean, we've got a pretty large political history here.
We certainly do.
Yeah.
No question about it.
What was the most interesting thing that you learned in researching the book and writing the book?
Henry, it's really interesting. Some of us in my field think we know a whole lot, but when we're writing a book, we find out how much we did not know that we thought we did know. And I think there are many, many answers one could give to your question, but when one actually looks at someone as a personality, and something I tried to do was to capture the flavor of the times and to capture the flavor and personalities of the people that I was writing about. And again, some of them come across quite differently in private than in public. A fascinating figure is Jesse Helms.
Yeah.
And as you know, people either loved him or loathed him in a number of cases.
Yeah.
And he was certainly one who would take a stand. His slogan was, "You know where he stands."
Yeah.
And normally one did know where he would stand, but he also, although he was most definitely a conservative and had a major, major influence in pushing the country and the Republican Party in a more conservative direction on certain social issues especially, he was also one who, just as an individual, one-on-one basis, was an extremely friendly, cordial individual. And something fascinating to me was in the background, some of the friendships he struck up with people like Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, who would be killed in an airline crash later on.
Remember that.
And was very liberal. If Jesse Helms was the most conservative member of the Senate, Paul Wellstone was the most liberal.
But they were friends?
And they got to be friends, that's right. And before going into the Senate, Paul Wellstone said the thing that he dreaded most about being there was being in the same room with Jesse Helms, and then they got to be really good friends. Not politically, but on a personal basis.
What was the reason for their friendship? That's interesting. How did their friendship develop?
Well, they were both very friendly, outgoing individuals.
Yeah.
I was actually in graduate school with Wellstone.
Is that right?
So I knew him at that time, but they were both friendly, outgoing individuals. And I think also, perhaps after the comment that had been made, Wellstone, went out of his way to be friendly to Helms, and Helms was certainly one who reciprocated, and again, both within the state and outside, was able to build those bonds with particular individuals.
If Jesse Helms was the face of the Republican Party over that era that people remember the most, the face of the Democratic Party had to be Jim Hunt.
Yes, at least during the last third of the 20th century.
So Jim Hunt, and a lot of people feel that Jim Hunt was the reason. Yeah, a lot of southern states, am I right about this? A lot of southern states, Texas, South Carolina, other southern Tennessee were going more conservative, going more Republican, especially during and right after the Reagan era. But North Carolina didn't, and the general feeling for all these years, Tom Eamon, has been that the reason for that was Jim Hunt had such a strong hold on the voters in North Carolina. Is that accurate, you think?
Jim Hunt was as skillful a politician, not only as North Carolina has ever seen, but I would say as the country has seen also. He was a great consensus builder in a lot of ways. He would compromise sometimes. He knew when to compromise, not to compromise. And whereas we can say that Helms was steadfastly conservative, Hunt was one who was harder to pin down in terms of ideology. He was certainly progressive in many respects. But
he was progressive, but he looked and sounded conservative to all the conservatives, does he not?
He did in many respects. And it was really funny when I was interviewing him and he was talking about the position a lot of liberals took toward compromise, and he actually made the comment, this is a direct comment, he said, the liberals just don't get it. Well, many conservatives, of course, considered Jim Hunt liberal, but he was really paranoid.
He said that to you when you were writing the book?
Yes,
that's
because in many cases, the people who were more liberal criticized him for making particular compromises that he did. But again, if Helms, certainly in his public persona, was more of a confrontational politician, Jim Hunt was more the consensus builder type politician.
And of course, Hunt and Helms met in a Senate race. What was that, 84?
1984.
84. Man, was that something. At that time, that was the most expensive United States Senate race we'd ever had.
In any state in the Union, not just in North Carolina, but in any state in the Union. And
of course, you know, those of us who were old enough to remember it and who followed it remember the Hunt-Helms Senate race, and it was brutal.
It was, and the ads also, some of the cleverest political ads that one has ever seen, I think. And the Helms forces outdid the Hunt forces in terms of having ads that would appeal to individuals. And we've both agreed that Hunt was a great politician, but that was a disadvantage to some degree in 1984 because one of the techniques of the Helms campaign was to portray Jim Hunt as just a little bit too much of a politician and suggesting, well, maybe this man can't quite be trusted.
Yeah, exactly. I remember it well. Let's go back to before that era. Talk about Terry Sanford a little bit. Terry Sanford was an interesting North Carolina political figure. He was he had quite a liberal ideology, but was able to get elected in the early 70s when the state was, even the Democrats at that time were very conservative.
Right, or early 60s.
60s, right.
He was elected.
Was it 60s? Wow, I guess it was.
Getting back a ways. But he was elected, and the real election then, many would argue, was in the Democratic primary. And his leading opponent was a man named I. Beverly Lake, who was a law professor at Wake Forest, or had been, and was a strong segregationist in a time when the great majority of North Carolinians who were white still favored segregation. But Terry Sanford was able to defeat him, and he ran on a program of quality education. And so that was his big issue. And Sanford, interestingly enough, Henry, was not an especially charismatic figure, even though today he's considered one of the great governors of all time. I've done this before, including on the radio, but I will perhaps strain your patience and just tell about a campaign ad, and then we can mention his voice. But the one that he used most frequently had the theme, "There's a New Day Coming," and it went as follows, if you will pardon my singing. The man on the go for the state on the go, that's Terry Sanford. There's a new day coming, so for your next governor, vote for Terry Sanford. This is Terry Sanford. I believe that quality education is the most important issue facing the voters of North Carolina today. If you agree with me, vote for Terry Sanford in the upcoming primary. There's a new day coming, so for your next governor, vote for Terry Sanford. Well, he was not just oozing
No,
with
you
charisma,
gotta
but
get applause
still,
for that. You gotta
he
get
was
applause
certainly
for
one
that. That was
who,
great. That was awesome.
He was one who, through just strategy, knowing people, was able to get a whole lot done in the area of education, and also he smoothed the way, helping the state make the transition from a very segregated place racially to moving toward a new
Yeah,
society.
that was an interesting time, wasn't it?
It surely
and
was.
of course, John Kennedy was president.
Right.
And I don't know, do you cover in your book the trip that John Kennedy made to Greenville? Because you see the pictures when John Kennedy was campaigning here in Greenville in 1960 at the old football stadium here
Yes.
down on 10th Street. You see the pictures of he and Terry Sanford riding in the limousine together.
Yes. Here's something amazing about that election. You know, and probably a lot of the listeners know, but a lot of the younger ones perhaps would not, that John Kennedy was a Catholic. And at that time, the view was a Catholic could not win in this country, or it would be difficult. And North Carolina was an overwhelmingly Protestant state. But Kennedy campaigned hard here. Sanford campaigned hard for him. And North Carolina was close, but the area that really won North Carolina for him was eastern North Carolina. And Kennedy got, and it was a Democratic area then, but Kennedy got 68% of the vote in eastern North Carolina. He did better in eastern North Carolina than he did in his home state of Massachusetts,
Really?
as a matter of fact.
How about that?
And there were few areas in the entire nation that voted any more strongly for Kennedy than eastern North Carolina did. I think part of it was that they considered the Democrats more sympathetic on tobacco issues, such as price supports that were important to the farmer. And also part of it was that Kennedy did really campaign hard in this area.
The name of the book is The Making of a Southern Democracy. Our guest is Tom Eamon. He is the author. And if you're watching TV there, you can see Tom Eamon's picture along with the cover of the book. Nice looking book. You got the cover of the state capitol building.
Right. UNC Press, I have to give credit for that. They're a great press.
Yeah.
And their people were the ones who designed the cover.
You sang the Terry Sanford song. You know who used to sing when Walter Dalton was running for governor? He used to sing the Nick Galifianakis song. Do you? I guess when Galifianakis was running against Jesse Helms, he had some sort of a song. And when Walter Dalton ran, you know, remember the commercial that he ran when he was running for lieutenant governor? Walter Dalton, Walter Dalton, Walter Dalton. He said that he got that idea from an old Nick Galifianakis.
Have you heard the Nick song?
Can you do that one?
Oh, I could.
Yeah,
Yes.
I want to hear it. I think we need to hear you sing again.
Okay.
Here we go.
N stands for Nick Galifianakis. I is for his integrity. C stands for Congress. K is for keep him there. Send Nick back to Washington, D.C.
And Galifianakis, who by the way was Zach Galifianakis, the famous actor now.
That's correct.
That was his uncle, right?
Yes. Yeah. I know Nick Galifianakis, as a matter of fact, and once saw him in a restaurant, and just for the fun of it, I did a take on the song and said, well, his opponents, this was after he was in Congress, could have done a different one, and they could have had, just for the fun of it, N stands for Nick Galifianakis. I is for his incompetency. C stands for Congress. K's for kick him out. Kick Nick back to Durham, NC.
And Jesse Helms beat him pretty bad, as I recall, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And that was, of course, the rise of Jesse Helms in a sense as a politician in 1972. Nick Galifianakis was defeated by Jesse Helms.
Jesse had risen to fame by doing editorials on WRAL television.
Yes.
And that's how he got to be famous.
That's right. He had other positions, including a major position in the State Banking Association, but it was the editorials on WRAL that really got him well known. And a lot of people said, well, he's just too extreme. And Helms himself thought he was probably going to lose the race when he started out, but he ran in a good year. and Richard Nixon was running for re-election. People didn't know about Watergate then,
Yeah.
and he won by a landslide in the country, and an even bigger landslide in the state. He got about 70% of the vote, and that was able to help not only Jesse Helms, who was a conservative Republican, but Jim Holshouser, who was a moderate Republican, was elected governor
Yeah.
in that same year.
Talk about, we've talked about some of the, the 60s, some of the 70s. Let's come up through the modern era. One
In
of the,
many respects, the most interesting of all, too.
yeah, the interesting thing about this book, I don't know how much you cover in the book, but the change in the mentality of the North Carolina voter. North Carolina was such a Democratic state. I talked about earlier, and I'm sure you cover the hold that everybody thinks Jim Hunt had on the state. But as we move forward, and other states are becoming more Republican, more of a red state, North Carolina has been slower to make that transition. Yet it seems like even the Democratic voters in North Carolina, the ones that they don't, some of them refuse still now to change their political affiliation. But it's a very conservative, for the most part, state, or maybe it just seems that way to me. What's the truth about that?
It's a state that's contradictory in a lot of ways, I would say, and you're absolutely right that during the Jim Hunt era, Mike Easley, that North Carolina had Democratic governors when many states were having Republican governors. And if you go way back, it was a solidly Democratic state. But something interesting is that on the presidential level, it broke from the Democrats a long time ago. And Nixon carried North Carolina in 1968. And then in 8 of 9 elections from then on, North Carolina went Republican for president. And then we have a situation in 2008 where Barack Obama, who is from Chicago and black, was the Democratic nominee for president.
And probably the most liberal member of the Senate.
And certainly much more liberal than the average member of the Senate. And he carried North Carolina by a very narrow margin, but he carried it. And then in 2012, he lost it, but it was the closest state of all that he did lose. It was still very close, and so it's odd that on the presidential level, unexplainable, I try to explain it in the book, but that in so many elections, North Carolina had been red in terms of presidential politics, and then the pattern was broken in 2008. And a lot of the explanation of that, I think, is what is happening in a lot of the urban areas of North Carolina. And you're right that much of North Carolina is conservative, but in a lot of the urban areas, not only are there more minority voters, but there are a lot of people moving in from states in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest, and California. And at one time, that meant more Republicans, but in recent years, as you know, those states have shifted in a very Democratic direction for president, at least. A lot of it on social issues. And just as, let's say, our Southern Baptists in North Carolina are conservative on social issues, there are a lot of people, including former moderate and liberal Republicans, who are more liberal on social issues. And they're moving into North Carolina, and that's having a big impact in places like Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, Winston-Salem, and it was really the big urban areas that carried it for Obama. Like in 2008, when he carried North Carolina, it was just about 14,000 votes, but just in Mecklenburg County alone, the county of Charlotte, he won by 100,000 votes, and there were 8 counties in the state that more than accounted for his margin in the state.
And you have to kind of say that was the factor. That might have been the tipping point to push the state, interestingly, back in the other direction. Because then in 2010, the Republicans take over the State House. And that was a big deal because that was redistricting year,
yes.
right?
This is absolutely fascinating. Just as the Democrats are beginning to do better on the presidential level, the Republicans have greater control over state offices in the legislature than they've ever had. And Henry certainly hit the nail on the head that the Republicans were fortunate enough to win the 2010 elections. Now, for 100 years prior to that, the Democrats had controlled the state legislature at the time of the redistricting. And just in case some of the listeners aren't aware of this, the official reason for having a census every 10 years is so you can reapportion for Congress and now for legislative districts also. Well, the Democrats have been doing it for 100 years, and now in 2010, the Republicans win the legislature, so they get to do it, and in a sense, it's payback time.
Oh, yeah.
And so the Republicans certainly took advantage of the opportunity to pay back the Democrats for what they had been doing for the last 100 years and drew the districts in such a way that they would be favorable to
I can't believe this, but we're out of time. And we hadn't covered Mike Easley, Bev Perdue. We didn't get to anything about McCrory. You got to come back so we can do that.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and be glad to be with you anytime.
And you'll be tonight. You'll be signing the book tonight at Jefferson's 5 to 7. You'll be there. People can come down and get a book.
Have a chance to chat informally with people.
If you got questions that I didn't ask Tom Eamon, go tonight and ask him at Jefferson's. Good luck with the book. I hear the book's doing great, and I appreciate you finally coming on.
I'm really pleased with the reception, but special pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Tom Eamon, The Making of a Southern Democracy, North Carolina Politics, from Car Scott to Pat McCrory.